Should we support Christian nationalism? Is the war in Ukraine a pointless war? And what are the consequences of teachers teaching radical ideas to students? We tackle these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through social media and we find the most interesting takes and we try to give them critiques, see if they're good or bad and what makes them interesting. My name is Donald and I'm here with my co-host Britt. And before we get started, just a reminder to give us a like and a comment and follow us on socials at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. And without further ado, we'll get into the takes. So the first one comes from General Douglas McGregor. He tweets, "Bottom line is an elite class that revolves around Washington, London, and New York City has decided to wage war on Russia for their own reasons. This has nothing to do with the interests of Europeans or the Western world. It's time to negotiate." He, of course, is speaking to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict here. What do you make of this take, Brett?
This is a great take. Douglas McGregor is usually very good on most things, and it's unfortunate that this chance of negotiation is closer today than it was 2 years ago when it got shot down by the United States and pressure from Boris Johnson. But this is the story of any war that we wage overseas, at least in the past 100 years. We have a lot of moral outrage that's built up, a lot of propaganda that is later proven to be, false and full of lies. And we say we need to keep funding to the tune of millions or billions or trillions of dollars into this conflict. And then sometimes American lives also need to be spent on it. And then at the end of it, we are left either at the same point when we started the war with the same types of objectives, or we're worse off. And you can think of like Iraq and Afghanistan recently. And then obviously in Ukraine, we funded them for almost 2 years now with this Ukraine-Russian conflict, knowing, and a lot of people like Douglas McGregor and other folks of his persuasion were saying, hey, Ukraine can't actually win this war. Probably the best tactic is for us to negotiate some sort of peace deal so that we limit lives lost. But instead, what we did is we just used the Ukrainians as meat shields to fund our military-industrial complex, make money for them, and we've literally wasted hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, prolonging this conflict when it could have been ended shortly after it began. But yeah, that's the whole. It all follows the same pattern. It's we must fund this war, like in Afghanistan or Iraq. The stake of the world is at stake if we don't fund this war. And they have every right to defend themselves. And if you don't support them, then you're a fascist, loving, whatever. And then it turns out, later, once a new war, maybe one like in Israel right now, is starting to brew up and we need to send money there. And there's a new way for the military industrial complex to make money. It's like, oh no, maybe we should start negotiating. And it's like, man, hundreds of thousands of lives later and millions and trillions of dollars later, we're still left with the same outcome that we would have had, several years back if we had just chosen peace instead of war.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you almost feel like the moment the entire consensus of the media and government officials are shutting down an idea specifically, that there might be some merit to that idea. Because it's one of those things where at the start of the whole conflict, I feel like the normal, rational, reasonable response would be, I don't know exactly what's going on here. Let's assess and evaluate. And that's kind of where I was, right? Where it's, I don't love the idea of rushing into a conflict. And from the outset, I don't like the idea of Russia marching into Ukraine. But let's pause, think, reflect, and assess. And so that's the kind of time when people start saying, well, I think we should do this. I think we should do that. And those are the times when it's like, let's not shut down ideas acutely, right? So when someone says, well, maybe we should be thinking about it, this is like, maybe we need to consider negotiation because we don't want to waste lives and this is not really a winnable conflict. When everyone goes, hey, silence that guy, shut him up, lock him away. You're like, okay, there's a concerted effort for this. It's not just I don't agree with that idea and it's bad and here's why. It's we can't even let this person have the appearance of legitimacy. Otherwise, that idea might catch on. And when that's happening, it's not about, I think your idea is dumb. It's about, we have to protect our own interests to some extent.
And like when people think of war, I guess when this inevitably happens again, because it's going to happen again. It already happened back in October, and I'm sure it will happen in the future. look at who stands to gain from the war, whatever war it is, being prolonged and hyped up and being, people requesting funding from Congress, taking our tax dollars. Look who stands to gain from that, and then also look at who, if there is a cross reference between who stands to gain and who is also being the biggest proponents of that war. And it's really crazy because it's literally 1-to-1. It's all the people that stand to gain are also the people saying that we have to go to these places and make war. And it should show you that their argument for that is not necessarily human flourishing, right? Like, I think most people think about war and how we should deal with it in a way that's like, hey, how do we actually encourage humans to flourish, humans to grow, humans to be at peace? And there are some people who don't think about it too often, but they're like, oh, well, people have a right to defend their land. But even in that case, they're thinking it from a human flourishing standpoint or a human rights standpoint. But you should know that the people that are the biggest, have the biggest megaphones hyping up these wars stand a lot to gain from it. And their goal is not human flourishing. It's just to enrich their pocketbook.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, we'll move on to the next take here. This one is a comic that is to illustrate a point here. It shows an individual flexing, saying, "I beat cancer," and then looking around and then saying, "If they suddenly find a cure for cancer now, I'm going to be so mad." With the last caption reading, "This comic is about crossed out student loans. Pretty much everything that reactionaries get pissed off about." Okay, is this a good point? Is this person making solid?
This is a terrible point. And the biggest flaw with this is that cancer, and I'm not saying this in a way that's like saying like, oh, cancer's awesome, but cancer is free and it is deterministic, more or less. There are certain things you do within your life that can like increase your chances of getting it, but you either get it or you don't, and it's not like you choose to get it or not get it. And it doesn't necessarily cost someone something else for you to get it. If this needed to be more like akin to the student loan situation, it would be like, oh, like in order for me to get $1 million, I have to give someone else cancer. I mean, that's literally what it means to take out a loan, is you are taking money from someone else and using it for your own benefit. And now that the loan is being forgiven, all the people that promised to pay it back are actually subsidizing your usage of that loan. They've actually paid for you to go through with that loan. You have taken from them. This meme totally gets it wrong because it's like, yeah, like beating cancer, yes, there's costs and all the little minutia and stuff, but like I said, it's free and deterministic. Like you either kind of randomly get it or you don't get it. And just because you're cured of it doesn't mean someone else is harmed. Whereas if you forgive a student loan, you actually are actively harming someone. It's almost like you're passing cancer on to someone else for you to be cancer free. I don't know if you have any more ways to expand upon it.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's the idea about student loans is you are actively taking from other people. It's a completely different scenario. It'd be like, for instance, if when you were, in order to have cancer or in order to recover from cancer, everyone in society was compulsory, had to give something to it, and the only reason why that was the case is because the government was specifically not allowing a cure for cancer to be found or something. It's not really a good contrivance, because there's not really anything like it, because the student loan economy is such a manipulated thing. It's not a natural occurrence like anything else in this world, or any other disasters are. It's a completely created scenario where you are essentially robbing other people and telling them to pay for the mistakes of others that they're specifically choosing to make. Even in like a natural disaster scenario where a town gets wrecked, even in that scenario, like people will pitch in voluntarily and they'll choose to do this. No one actively chooses to cause that kind of a storm. But with the student loan crisis, these are people who are setting this kind of thing up. It'd be like if someone was, like the government was doing fiery experiments in a town near a forest, and they're setting themselves up for failure. You're setting the town up to be burned down. In that case, I think you'd be right to be mad about the forest getting burned down, and then them making you pay for recovering. I think it's one of those things where if finding a cure for cancer was like forgiving student loans, then there would be less resentment. Which is to say, if you could have a one-stop solution that just fixed the problem of the debt, that somehow magically created this wealth, that restored the lost fortunes to an equal level, people probably wouldn't be as mad about it. But the reality is that people are mad because they've been duped, they've been forced to pay, and now that new people would get theirs all together forgiven, you wouldn't actually be even solving the problem. You wouldn't even be fixing the issue. You would just be bailing out a select group of people at one point in time while doing nothing to fix the whole issue, the whole problem, and people who were owed things would not get those things back. That's the ultimate. You would be forced to pay to bail other people out, and it wouldn't even solve the problem. So there's lots of layers why people would be mad about student loans being forgiven.
Yeah, the other aspect that's really funny about it is the majority of student loan debt is held by folks that are the most privileged by these people's standards among us, mainly being graduate students, people who have not only voluntarily decided to go into college, undergraduate, but then decided, oh yeah, this was worth it enough for me to take more loans, to take more school and get a graduate degree. So they not only, like, you could be somewhat sympathetic, I would say, to a student in high school, their senior year, they've been told their entire life, you're not going to be able to make it if you don't get a college degree. You got to go. You're 18, and they're saying, hey, saddle yourself with $200,000 in debt and go. It's what everyone does, and if you don't do it, you're going to be poor. I can be somewhat sympathetic to the cause, like, hey, like, you kind of took advantage of someone who we, in general, don't consider has the ability to consent. They were being pitched colleges way before the age of 18. Some of them even get accepted and sign up to go before the age of 18, and then they get saddled with this debt for life that can never be forgiven, even in bankruptcy. But there is absolutely no excuse for the people that complete college, know how it all goes, know how difficult it is to get a job, and maybe even how worthless a college degree is, than to take on more debt, almost the equal amount of debt, doubling the amount of debt that they took to get school, to go into the graduate programs. Those are the people that want us, who did not go get graduate degrees, to fund their ability to not have loans. And guess what? Those people are also set up, supposedly, to get higher paying jobs than everyone else. So it's literally the most privileged and educated among us that are saying, like, oh, it costs us nothing for you to forgive our debts. But it's like, all the people that didn't go do that stuff, that don't have the advanced degrees, are the ones paying into the pile and have already paid off their debts. So there really is no, like I was saying, sympathy towards the folks that were, literally high school kids that were duped into it. But, fool me once, shame on me, shame me once, shame on you, but fool me twice, shame on me. Like, those folks have no excuse for requesting college loan debt being forgiven.
Yeah, there's two more things that your comment there made me think of. One is, it is that lost opportunity cost, I think, that makes a lot of people mad, right? Because I don't begrudge someone who gets something out of because good fortune is bestowed upon them. Like, I don't begrudge, like, oh, my friend made he happened to luck out he started a business right before a big boom happened of interest in that particular thing, and just the way that the market went, he got really lucky and became very successful. I don't begrudge him that. But if you're being promised one thing and you're being told one thing, and then the powers that be sort of bait and switch, and your decisions, your own choices are being shaped and factored by the truth. For instance, like, if you take out a loan, you have to pay it back, and then you make that consideration. You choose not to go to a very, very expensive school because you don't think you can pay that back because you're being responsible. All of those time preferenced choices that cascade down are being punished. And so it's one of those things where the irreversible currency is people's past choices of being responsible. And you then in the future also create disincentives to be wise, long-term thinking, and productive in those kinds of ways, because the demonstration is, oh, well, if things get bad enough, you'll just get bailed out by the government.
Yeah.
The other thing is, when we're talking about people getting bailed out, it's never either the loan companies or the government that's incentivizing the loan companies to give out these because a lot of them are government-backed loans. Like, they're never the ones taking the fall and the blame. If this came out and it was like, okay, any company that gave a loan to a college student that can't pay it back, they have to front the cost, that would be different. But we know what happens is it's these government-backed loans. It's the government that's backing, so it's going to be taxpayer money. It's never the actual individuals that are responsible for giving out unsafe loans that are the ones taking the fall. So you look at like the housing crisis, you look at any sort of the bank bailouts. It's like the banks are getting bailed out by the government. The housing lenders that are offering these things that were giving out loans that should not have been, they're getting funded by the government, and taxpayers are on the line. So that's the other issue. It's like, if we are worried about the students, like you mentioned, who are being taken advantage of, and we do have genuine concern for, because it's not really their fault, who should pay for the mistake of them being saddled with all that debt if they aren't in fact responsible? Well, the people who sold it to them. And who are the people who sold it to them? Well, not you and I, but we're the ones who end up paying for it. And that's another one of the cascading problems with student loan forgiveness, as its current policy iteration usually is talked about.
Yeah.
Okay, our next tweet comes from Rachel Wilson, who tweets, "Let's try again, Christians. 1, you're going to be overruled and governed. Sorry, you're going to be governed / ruled, parentheses, sorry, anarchists and libertarians. 2, your country, state, and locality will have laws. So tell me why, as Christians, you don't think these laws should be informed by Christian morality and should be secular instead."
Yeah. This is kind of a weird tweet because it mixes the strength of language between, like, it's like, oh, you're going to be governed, and because of that, like, shouldn't it be informed, like the laws that are on the books be informed by Christian morality? But of course, we know what this means, and maybe some background on this. There was a statue, a Satanist statue, I believe, put up in a town hall or government building. I can't remember which. I think it was in Illinois,
Iowa.
In Iowa, yeah, in Iowa, and a Christian. I think it was one of the state house folks came in and chopped its head off, and so it's generally a lot of debate. And this is what she's kind of referencing here. I think that this is kind of I reject the question, I guess you could say, in that like Matthew 20 in the Bible, and this is me responding to it as a Christian and as a anarchist / libertarian. Matthew 20 lays out that Christians are not supposed to rule over each other or others in the way that the Gentiles, and Gentiles being people who are not Christians or secular people, rule over each other, that you're supposed to be a servant, that the greatest among you should also be the least. And so government is like akin to, like, this tweet is like akin to saying, hey, you're going to be ruled over by the mafia. Wouldn't you at least want them to have Christian imagery, in their mafia halls as they rule over you? And it's like, like, maybe that's slightly better, but like the entire premise of a mafia is counterintuitive to Christianity, and nothing that the government can do to make us better people can't be accomplished by Christians doing it independently of the government by persuading hearts and minds through reason and argumentation and demonstration of goodness and love and generosity and all that stuff. And so, yes, we want like laws as much as they have to exist or will exist, I suppose, to be informed by Christian ethics. The problem with this is that there are usually corrupt people implementing those laws, and laws inevitably will be enforced at the endpoint of gun or whatever use of force is capable at that time. And I don't think that any of us would say, and as much as like this is like a very like Reddit, neckbeard kind of argument, they always bring up the Crusades or they bring up the Catholic Inquisition. I think it's actually a valid point in this instance that Christianity never does well when it is codified in law and enforced, because it's usually enforced with like awful violence and torture, which would not be in line with the way that Christianity and the Bible lays out how it's supposed to be practiced. And so if we're actually for a better practicing of Christianity and more people coming to know who Jesus is, and for the religion to be spread in a way that, creates actual true followers of it, I don't think that ever can occur through the force of law and the government. And yes, we want like our lawmakers to come to know Christ, but I think that the best path would be for a lawmaker to come to know Christ and then to step down from being one of the lawgivers. What do you think?
Well, so there's a lot to be said. You particularly reference, like the Crusades, but even more to bolster that point, what did the Crusades come out of? Well, it came out of years of the sort of sanctioned church, legally speaking, being totally lax. Priests and friars and the entire congregations were debaucherous. They were immoral, and so you had, I believe it was, and I could be totally misspeaking here, but I believe it was Saint Ignatius of Loyola who started this sort of movement of bringing back I think he started the Jesuits, and that was sort of this, grouping of people who were very militant and diligent about their faith as part of. I think it was part of the Counter Reformation, if I recall correctly, because one of the complaints of the Protestant Reformation was the lax piety and morality of the Catholic Church, and so you had this Counter Reformation of strict militant, like we need to get back to where we were, and so not only was the Crusades sort of this. I mean, there were multiple crusades, so maybe we're talking about different time periods here too. But not only were the crusades this sort of literal militant return to, trying to enforce faith in a way that was brutal and bloody and not in line with a lot of what Christianity taught, but it came out of a period of the complete opposite of what Christianity taught in the other way, where there were just lax morals, nothing was actually held to, and the state sanctioned religion was effectively meaningless. I know I brought this up on a recent episode as well, but as William Lane Craig points out, you look at the United States and the European countries that were codified as Christian nations, and the US was codified as not a Christian nation, but you look at them and culturally, the US is still way more Christian than the nations who at one point were supposed to be codified by state as Christians. So I think you look at the reality and you see that countries whose framework is supposed to be Christian and it's codified this way by law end up secularizing and becoming immoral and debaucherous and lax in anything relating to the religion much quicker, or they become very militant in it and become abusive of it in a violent way, because that is the tool of the state. Whereas if you have a country that is governed by a culture of Christian or moral values, but its entire premise and principle founding is one of limiting its own power, you're going to have it at least stay better and more moral for a longer period of time. Even the church itself is not immune from being corrupt and going in on itself in certain areas to, not being a moral system. And so that's why you have like church bylaws that give measured control over the bishops or the priests or the pastors. You have boards that are supposed to rein in and keep them accountable. And so if you think about it in that, where churches don't have the force of violence at their disposal, and yet you still have corrupt churches, even with measured kind of types of restraint, how much more would that be the case when, and how much more is it the case as we look at our government, when you do have the levers of power, when you do have the quote unquote legitimate use of force and violence? So to me, it's like, yeah, when you have something in society, if you're going to have laws and if you're going to be ruled, well, then the principle that should be founded on, sure, we should have a moral culture, but the legal framework should be, how do we limit the power that we have as this institution? And the entire premise should be, like, our philosophy is limit our own power as a government. That should be the sort of the ideology of a government of laws. And it should be, what can we do to restrain this? Because it is the only thing that we would say is, again, quote unquote, legitimate use of force.
Yeah, and what's funny about that, like, yes, that is an ideal, but I don't think there is any more utopian view than the belief that you can have like a limited government that stays limited the entire time. Like, it's just not possible. Like, it's the nature of government for it to grow and to get bigger. And so, Christians and conservative Christians who say, oh, well, we want to return to whatever this constitutional republic is and this limited government and states' rights. It's like, yeah, like, return to it for it to grow back to where it is today. That's what it is. Like, if you really want to advocate for something that's different, that doesn't change into something terrible like it is today, you have to advocate, one, for it to be abolished completely, and then two, obviously, like, that doesn't do away with our duty to help guide a moral society. I don't think we agree with Rachel, at least, that it should be guided by the point of a gun.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, our next take reads, everyone's yelling about birth rates declining, marriages declining, and degeneracy, but hardly anyone is asking why. Most men have become superfluous and do not see marriage as a benefit. You can hand wave about how great it is all day long, and I do have a great marriage. But until you give men an incentive instead of 100% legal responsibility inside a marriage with 0% legal authority, nothing will change. What do you make of that tweet?
So I'm disclaimer speaking as this. I identify with this guy. I have a fantastic marriage. I have a wonderful wife, and I have a beautiful little daughter. And I think that the benefits of our marriage are just amazing. Like, I am so much better off today than I was before I was married. But I also can acknowledge the reality that this guy speaks to, and that's, a lot of folks. It's very hard to find a partner given this reality, and he lays out that there's 100% legal responsibility, but you have 0% legal authority. You pay almost all of the family courts will rule against you in cases of custody of children if your wife chooses to divorce you. Most of the time, it's arranged against you. So there's very little benefit to being married legally, and then all of the detriment of being married. And so, given that, you have to be really careful and selective of who you are going to choose to marry. You have to have the utmost trust in them, and I wouldn't say that's any different, right, than what you should do normally when you're going to get married. Like, you should absolutely trust this person and do all of your due diligence on them and all this stuff. But there's always going to be a little bit of a question mark until you tie the knot, because marriage inherently is a bit of a risk, because there's no way to 100% know who that person is going to be 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 30 years from now, or within this given situation. And so it's definitely more of a risk for men when they are getting married or partnering with someone than it is for women. And unfortunately, like, this is also paired with like a society that has incentivized and emphasized individual freedom of, like, I could do what I want and I need to not submit to any family structure. Like, I was just talking with a friend of mine who's not doing super well, but they were talking about, like, oh yeah, like, I, like, in terms of finding a partner, like, what matters most to me is that I'm happy. And that's a symptom of this cultural shift that's taking place of not being, subservient to family structures and to legacy, and being more serving yourself and your own individuality and your own happiness. And so you combine that reality that many women and men have that individual, drive where they only want to be happy. That's the primary thing. It's not to create a family, to create a lasting legacy. And then pair it with the fact that any potential legal outcomes favor one side more. Obviously, the side that is not favored, if they both want to have happiness and they also are not going to potentially get happiness and be on the losing end if they enter into a contract, of course they're not going to want to do that. Of course there's going to be a decline in marriages. Of course there's going to be a lack of respect for human dignity, and there's going to be tons of degeneracy. So all of the systems, and that's no excuse for someone's moral behavior, but it is true that the system is incentivizing this type of behavior, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's one of those things where it sounded almost like, because of the way that he was wording the legal responsibility and authority, that you want like a legal solution to this. And to me, it is one of those things where I think this will mostly affect a culture and a time and place of people that are not morally grounded, right? Because the more of the same morals and of the same values of faithfulness, loyalty, exclusivity in a marriage that you have, the less of a problem it's going to be to find, men and women who are compatible with that, and where men will see the benefit, right? Because, regardless of the legal authority or responsibility, if I'm 100% sure that my wife and I are living within the bounds of what, a Christian marriage is, I don't have to worry about what the law thinks about that in terms of responsibility or authority if things go wrong, because we're in something much more striking, much more important, and much more binding than any legal authority. But the problem is, we don't live in that society, right? We don't live in an age when that is the overriding moral grounding of people. And so I do think that a lot of there definitely are men in this situation too, but or men and women in this situation too. But I think that a lot of young men are trying to have a particularly hard time with this, because it is very difficult for them to find a partner that shares that, men or women, trying to find their respective a respective potential spouse who's going to have that same binding of, no, sleeping around isn't cool, and we're in this for forever, for life. That's what this is, and you don't get the benefits of marriage without being married, because otherwise it's a perversion. If you don't have that grounding, then this is sort of the natural, I don't know, it seems like the natural course of this kind of thing. I think even if you tried to make the marriage equation more balanced, I think then you would have women, generally speaking, not wanting to be a part of it as well. Because if you don't have a moral people trying to make agreements within a moral framework with each other, there's always going to be imbalance then. The key thing here is that marriage is a moral institution,
Mm.
and it's something that the law cannot prescribe. It can definitely help incentivize or guide or hinder or hurt, but it can't create the basis for which marriage will be successful. It can
Yeah.
try to break it, but as long as we're thinking about it primarily as a legal institution, I think you would miss the entire point of how a successful marriage is going to operate. Because, like, I think you and I would both agree, like, it doesn't matter if our wives are like, well, yeah, we're in this legal binding agreement according to the law, but they don't have any spirit of like what the Christian definition of marriage is. I think you and I would recognize that our respective marriages wouldn't last very long if we held deeply to a Christian marriage definition and our wives didn't, or vice versa.
Yeah, and like for ages, and a lot of people take issue with this, but for ages, the standard for how families are structured is men work and women take care of the home and the family and everything. And like now that I have a daughter, and I've seen my wife go through 27 hours of active labor to have her, it's like, oh man, okay, like if she can go through that, then I can also work my entire life to make sure that we're provided for and everything. Like it's, I think we have an equal bearing of suffering in terms of like that suffering's condensed a little bit more for her and in a very powerful and awful way. And then men's suffering is supposed to be longer and drawn out and taken over time. But the point of the matter is that's a team effort. That marriage and the family structure has always been a man with certain sets of skills and giftings as a man, and a woman with certain specific giftings and skills as a woman come together. And the whole purpose of those skills and giftings is to create a healthy and happy family. And like you were saying, the law can't prescribe that you work together as a team. It can't. There's no law or legislation that can make that happen. It can hinder it. And I think what Kyle in this tweet is pointing out is that the law does hinder that, right? Because if a man is going to sacrifice X amount of resources and time and energy and assume full legal responsibility for a family and all this stuff, but then has 0% ability to, exercise the other aspects of his authority within a marriage, then yeah, the team is not going to function properly. You have one teammate that is hampered and not able to do their part. And like you're saying, if this flung the other way, it would be just as devastating to the family unit, regardless of whether it's for men or for women. And so the point that we need to get to is that like we have a lot of individuals, both men and women, who desire freedom within relationships without any of the responsibility and without any of the duty that comes with that. And the only type of beings on this planet that have freedom without any responsibility are babies. And so the folks that want this are literally behaving like babies. If you want to have the benefits of a marriage, if you want to have the benefits of a romantic partner and all that stuff, you also get the duty of building a legacy and all the teamwork that goes into that. And yes, that requires that you submit to certain types of authorities and certain types of obligations within that marriage that you've entered into.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. All right, our last take here, I believe, is a sign from a public school with a little note next to it that was added after the fact to the internet. So the first note from the school reads, "If your parents aren't accepting of your identity, I'm your mom now." And it shows a little polar bear adopting, like, I don't know, they're holding like LGBT flags or whatever. Anyway, and then the note next to it reads, "In economics, a moral hazard is a lack of incentive to guard against risk where one is protected from its consequences. Teachers acting as parents demonstrates a classic moral hazard. They lack incentives to guard against risks to the child because they are socially and legally protected from consequences." All right, what do you make of that take?
I assume we're critiquing the little note on it.
Yeah, the one on the right. We can just kind of talk about it as a whole.
In general, yeah. So this little blurb is correct, and we've all kind of intrinsically known this. It's like a age-old human wisdom thing that the person who cares most about their kids is going to be the parents, and that the further out you get away from family members, the less that person can actually care about the kid. And like it's saying, it lacks the incentives to guard against risk because you're not socially or legally responsible for what comes next. And so one of the big problems about, let's just take on like hormone blockers that are given to kids that are prepubescent, at the age of 11 or 12 or whenever, you don't necessarily see, I mean, you see the effects of those pretty fast, but you don't know the consequences of them in terms of the consequences to the child until maybe a decade later when they're now, 20, 21, 22, and they actually maybe don't feel that way, or maybe they never would have felt that way, but now that they've done irreversible damage to some of their core body parts, the teacher that is can be their mom now if their parent doesn't affirm their identity is not going to be anywhere to be found. This is also experienced by like the doctors who perform these surgeries. So you could there are certain Reddit subreddits you can go to and certain like X profiles that allow, or not that allow, but that show like testimonies from folks who have transitioned, and they talk about how their doctors were very, very quick to get them in to have some part of their body changed or chopped off. And then once they said, hey, like this is not functioning the way I expected it to, or maybe I'm having these problems, or I'm now getting these types of infections, or my body's rejecting this type of change, doctors are nowhere to be found and refer them elsewhere or say, hey, we can't help you. We can only do the initial procedure. So all of the incentives for all of these types of procedures are not aligned, or they're being advocated by the people that they affect the least after they are implemented. And these people gain all of the benefits, whether through social virtue or through financial mechanisms like doctors at the top of it. And then by the time they're done, they just wash their hands of it and they're all done. And everyone else is left to pick up the pieces, including the patient or the child.
Yeah, it's kind of like, thinking of it as this economic principle. You learn this as a kid, hopefully from parents who are responsible. And you see when parents aren't responsible in teaching their kids this entire premise. So for instance, if a kid, breaks their toy and the parents like, oh, I'll just buy you another one. They learn, well, I don't have there's no consequence to me treating this thing poorly because I'll get a new one, right? So there's no consequence there versus a kid who's taught like, all right, this is your room. You have to pick it up because you have to be responsible. And if if you break your toy, like we're not going to get you a new one. So you have to treat things well, and et cetera, et cetera. So the more direct connection you have to the consequence of something, the more you care about the long-term outcome of it. And so, like you said, teachers, historically teachers have sort of this really strong connection with their students when they grow up. A lot of good teachers will have a strong connection with students that are really grateful for the impact that they had, because and that's a lot of the reason why you get teachers who are fulfilled, because good teachers produce good students who grow up to do great things, and then they have that, the consequence of their good teaching is a virtuous individual down the line. And that's why there's such a strong connection there when that happens. But the reality is that when there's, when you teach a student and their life doesn't go so well, you don't have that same level of consequence in the reverse. A teacher's often, not always, but often in the position of being able to reap the positive consequences of students who do well through good instruction or who turn out well, without having to have any of the harms of that student when things don't go so well for them. Now, they might suffer some emotional consequence in certain cases if they learn about things, but they're not going to actually have to be there picking up the pieces of whatever terrible thing could potentially happen. And so that's one of the really crazy things about it, the radicalizing of teachers, is that they are bringing children into new, frankly untested grounds, although they're being more and more tested every day, unfortunately, when it comes to trying to sexualize children, trying to sexualize their identities and bringing this into the mainstream and affirming things about students against their parents. You're setting their entire home life up to be abysmal and dangerous. And I mean, just think about it from even removed from the political aspect. Think about if a child is being indoctrinated into ideas that are contrary to their parents. If it's being done in a way where the child is free to express disagreement with their parent and then there's healthy dialogue, that's fine. But that's not what's happening in this poster, and it's not what's happening in general. They're being told, your parents are evil and wrong, and we will take you away from them. Like, just again, remove it from political context. Is that going to make their home life better or worse? And if it makes their life worse, does the teacher have any of that consequence, or does it only affect that family? Of course, it mostly affects the family. Maybe it will affect their school life a little bit if they're still with them for the long term. But this is a long term cause and effect of discord that you're sowing. And so it's just crazy to think that, again, if this was a healthy way to bring up disagreement or challenging norms, it wouldn't be done in such a way as to say disown your parents, reject them, fight them on this. Theologically, I'm a little bit different than my parents, and I learned that sort of a different perspective from the high school I went to. And instead of it being like, I shut my parents out and we got into fights, we had like debates about it. We disagreed. We went through the exercises and still do to this day, on some things on politics. So, shout outs to my parents. They're great. And that's like the healthy way to have dissent and disagreement and things. And our teachers were never like, no, don't go home. And make sure not to talk to your parents about this. And if your parents disagree with this, I'm your theological guide. Now, it was always about the quality of the ideas, the long-term effect of it. But again, when there's not a consequence to this kind of thing, that's why they want to hide it. That's why they don't, because it does the damage and destruction that causes, they never have to reap.
Yeah. And like you're saying, your teachers may have given you some theologically different viewpoints, and then you went home and debated with your parents. And I'm sure if your parents took enough issue with that, they could have gone into your private school and talked with that teacher and not necessarily made the teacher discomfortable, but registered their discomfort with whatever type of viewpoint was being put out there if they thought it drastic enough. So that's like a type of incentive or signal, maybe you should say, that like, hey, for teachers to like calibrate their behavior off of. What's crazy about the public school system right now is that like I'd even be okay. It's not something that I support, but like if there are teachers that want to put this stuff out there and then parents choose to get more involved after seeing this, get more involved with their kids' lives, and they go in and register their discomfort with this and displeasure with it and make it known that they don't support this and that they want things to be changed, what their kids are being taught, that would be a balance. That'd be almost like market level balancing of the culture, which would be awesome. But what you see instead, right, is you see parents showing up to these school board meetings getting put on FBI terror watch lists, which is wild. Them being hauled off, them not being allowed to talk to these teachers, them being banned from being able to go visit and say these things. And then on top of that, CPS being called in rare instances in places like California, and then especially now a lot in Canada, where if one parent does not affirm a kid's sexuality and makes it known to the school, CPS can be called and become involved in it. And so the signals have now been totally removed. Negative signals have been totally removed from teachers for them to recalibrate and to change their behavior to now where they're only incentivized to make these types of incentivized to make these types of overtures to children, which is really terrifying because now that even the teachers that could self-correct no longer have the signal to.
Yeah, exactly right. Like just every aspect of the public education system defies what normal market values would be.
Yeah.
It's like from a moral level, you don't get choice, and from a feedback mechanism, you don't get any kind of adaptability to respond. So it's kind of just the worst of all worlds.
Yeah,
which
really
is
a
cheery way to end this episode. But as the case may be, homeschool your kids or private school them if you can. And in the meantime, we'll try to get school choice as far as we can. Thanks for tuning in with us for this episode. We'll catch you on the next one. Take care.